For those of you who have just joined, I am Carolina, sustainability lead for NetGuru, the company that is behind this event. We are thrilled and happy to be running Disruption Forum Sustainability for the first time, actually. And our next guest speaker, or actually a person who will be leading the next panel, is Wojciech Bagiński. And the next panel, the next track, will prove that voluntary commitments are not enough for sustainable future. So the topic is how public policy regulations can bring us closer to sustainable future. And it will be hosted by Wojciech Bagiński, attorney and counselor at law, Bagiński.pro. I hope, Wojciech, you are there. Yes, you are.
I am.
Great to see you.
Good to be here. Good to be here with you. Thank you for the introduction. And if we may actually bring the other speakers to the stage, that would be good. Okay, so we have everybody. So again, depending on the time zone, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Wojciech Bagiński, and I have a pleasure to host this panel on public policy. I am a lawyer running an international practice. I'm a bit of a social entrepreneur and a friend of B-Lab, helping to expand the movement in Poland and in the EU. So we have magnificent guests today. Elizabeth, sorry for making probably a mistake in your last name. Soubelet, that's my best try. Co-founder at Squiz. And board member of B-Lab France. And we also have Rick Alexander, former head of policy at B-Lab in the US, and currently founder at the Shareholders Commons. So our plan for today is to talk a bit about public policy projects that are important to achieve a global shift in the economy toward a more sustainable and inclusive model. And we will think also what projects should the EU engage in the next decade, and talk a little bit about the socially related legal forms like the benefit corporation. So to start, I would like to ask Rick to tell us about yourself, your inspiring story, and about the public policy projects you were involved in and you are involved in, and the history behind them. So the mic is yours.
Thanks, Wojciech. One of the great things about having the name Alexander is, like, in international forums, everybody knows how to pronounce it. Thanks to you for setting this up. Thanks to NetGuru for putting this together. And I do want to talk a little bit about my own story, just because I hope it illustrates a little bit about how you can disrupt your own life, to sort of put things, right. And I did hear, the last speaker talking about the rainforest and how, really this is an effort that requires all of us, and that just couldn't be more true. So even when we talk about things in the public policy arena, I think public policy comes from people. And lots of people doing lots of little pieces makes it all happen. For me, I was a corporate lawyer in Delaware, and some of you may know that in the US, we have this federal system where wherever your business is located, you can choose any of the states around the country to incorporate in, and that's how you choose the law that governs the relationship between your shareholders, the board, management, and, as people recognize more and more, other stakeholders, sort of all the internal corporate governance. And Delaware has made a little business for itself of being the place that companies who want to raise money go, when they want to look serious, and they form a corporation and they raise money from venture capitalists and they go public, and they go through the whole life cycle of a corporation. And so what I did for 25 plus years was advise companies who were doing that. If they were, raising money through a stock offering, if they were doing a merger, if a public company had, a corporate governance crisis where it was being challenged by shareholders, they would look to law firms like mine for advice about what to do in that situation. And, in some ways it was a very simple job because we thought there were two things that happened in corporate law. One was that shareholders got to exercise their rights to decide who the board was, and the board then represented those shareholders by trying to make the company make a lot of money for them. And everything else was just a detail. And that was our basis. In 2010, I was on a committee of the bar that helped to keep the law current so that Delaware could keep up, with the business. And some people came to us and proposed, it turned out to be B-Lab, I'd never heard of them at the time, proposed that we amend our statute to provide an opportunity for companies to incorporate as something called a benefit corporation. And a benefit corporation would provide that actually, even though the shareholders elected the directors would then consider the interests of all stakeholders. And when I say consider, I mean, you might say, well, businesses always consider their stakeholders, because how could you run a business without thinking about your customers and your suppliers and your employees and your community? But what's different about the benefit corporation is you think of those not instrumentally. You don't think of those stakeholders as just ways to make money for your shareholders. You think about them in their own light. So it's as important that your employees earn a living wage as it is that your shareholders earn a reasonable return, or at least you have to weigh those things in the balance. And our reaction in Delaware was, that's very cute. That sounds like something that kind of a 60s radical might want to do, but that's not serious. If you're, it's not that we didn't think there should be public policies about climate and workers' rights. It's that was the job for the government, and business's job was to make money. Kind of a very, Milton Friedman, pro-market economy point of view, whatever your politics were. And so we sort of said, we don't want to do that. But they came back to us and they pushed us. And so we decided to study it. And I ended up being tasked with studying it. And I did a lot of reading. And one of the things I read was a book by a law professor, she passed away a few years ago, named Lynn Stout, who in a book called The Shareholder Value Myth explained all the reasons that theory doesn't really hold up. And I'll talk about some of that in the latter part. But one of the things she said was, corporations have interests, humans have interests, but if humans only looked after their own interests and just sort of, ran over people as long as it was legal, if they could earn another penny, you'd say that person was a sociopath. So why are we asking companies to be sociopathic? That doesn't make any sense. And that struck me. And anyway, I got very interested, and I ended up sort of helping write a statute for Delaware. And I got so interested in the whole program that I actually left my job and went to work for B-Lab. B-Lab, I'm sure a lot of you know this, B-Lab sort of promotes a more ethical form of profit-making companies around the world. They have lots of different programs, but one of the things they do is promote this legal form. They invented it in some sense. And so I went to work for B-Lab to help companies become benefit corporations. I was there for 4 years. It was a fantastic experience. In that time, when I started, there were, a few benefit corporations. Most of them were really small, they didn't have outside shareholders. Investors were very nervous. And although lots of states by then had adopted a statute, there wasn't a lot of uptake. Since then, there has been a lot of uptake. More than 10,000 have been formed in the United States. They have done over 300 documented financings, raised over $4 billion. There have now been 3 IPOs, and soon you will be able to buy 6 or 7 companies will be publicly traded in the United States in the benefit corporation form. And this is 7 doesn't sound like a lot, but almost all of that activity is in the last 8 or 9 months. So the curve is starting to go up, and we think with all the attention brought on stakeholder value and stakeholder governance due to, in the US, sort of the evidence before our eyes of climate change with the fires in the West, with the COVID crisis and businesses' complete unpreparedness for what was completely foreseeable, which I think can be laid at the feet of the chasing of shareholder value rather than, you know, real systemic value. This is a movement that's going to happen. And as I said, there have been 2 successful IPOs this summer. So those companies are now trading as benefit corporations. A couple of companies have announced, they're small companies, have announced that they're going to go to their shareholders and vote to become benefit corporations. And just last night, a company called Viva, it's a very, you know, sort of in the technology space, very well-known cloud company that I think they focus on bioscience, but a big cloud company with a $42 billion market cap announced that they were going to study becoming a benefit corporation. And so that's a Russell 1000 company. It's a big deal for them to make that change. And so this is, I think, what's happening. I will say internationally, in addition to the 38 US jurisdictions, 2 or maybe 3 countries now in South America have provided the benefit corporation option. Italy now has a benefit corporation option. British Columbia, a province in Canada, now has a benefit corporation option. And the recent report written by EY at the behest of the EC about corporate governance, while it doesn't have recommendations, if you read it carefully, I would say it essentially recommends that there be an EU directive that all companies adopt a form of governance, which is essentially benefit corporation governance, meaning that the directors have an obligation to consider the interests of all their stakeholders. And while, you know, Europe already is sort of ahead of the United States in stakeholder governance, a lot of that is really permissive. And when you, and the report does a really good job of explaining this. So even though directors might have more ability to consider the interest of their stakeholders, and you even have, you know, obviously countries with co-determination and employees on the board. Elizabeth's going to talk about what's going on in France. It's different than a mandate. And the difference between that and benefit corporation, where you have an enforceable obligation to consider the interests of stakeholders, I think can make a world of difference. And I mean that literally a world of difference. So it's an exciting time, I think, to be a corporate lawyer. People might laugh at that sentence, but you know, corporate lawyers can be part of disrupting the world. So that's kind of just an introduction.
Yeah, thank you for this. This is you're a very inspiring lawyer, and your history is also very inspiring. And I remember when I met you first, I was also reading some of your articles, and it inspired me to actually look into this benefit corporation concept. And a few years later, we are here and discussing this. So it's really a pleasure for me. So Elizabeth, I got a question for you. Can you tell us your story, because it's equally inspiring? And can you tell us, you know, how you got involved in B Corps, in B Lab? What are you working on right now? I know from our mutual work that you are an enthusiast of the benefit corporation legal structure. And I know that in your free time, you're following closely the different structures in Europe and in the US, and with the similar forms. Can you tell us, you know, what you think, and what is your story?
Sure. So, funny joke about my last name, Soubelet being hard to pronounce. My maiden name is actually Alexander. So, haha, Rick. I was born in Austin, Texas, and met my French husband at the University of Texas, and have lived in France basically ever since. I originally studied to be a special education teacher and a midwife. So where you see me sitting today is maybe a little bit considered a bit of an oddity. I can understand that. Basically, after the birth of our youngest, so our child, who's now about to turn 8. When he was born, we had just moved back from living 5 years overseas in Turkey. I really had kind of what you might call sort of an awakening about trash, basically, about waste and about pollution and about implications of consumer society and the way in which we move as a society from a treatment of objects as being of having quite a high value and of being important, and so wanting to use them for as long as possible, to a way in which we just use them like one time and just toss them away. You know, about like your jar of jam. Your jar of jam was actually built to last 50, 100 years, but today we use it one time and we toss it, even if it's in the recycling, we're still tossing it after one use. So I started having a lot of questions about kind of where we were going with that, which led to the creation of our business, which started with my husband, which started with a product called Squiz, which is a replacement for single-use baby food pouches. So it's a food pouch you can fill and wash and reuse. That's where we started. And it was important to me to then have, here I found myself kind of marketing an ethical product and very much want that to be embedded within an ethical structure. And that's how I got interested in corporate structure. And at the time, in 2014, the very first B Corp in France was just in the process of certifying, as Utopies. And so we were lucky enough, right at the end of that process, became a venture partner for B Lab Global, and then kind of invited all of their friends and family and neighbors and anybody to join in. And there were about 20 companies at the very beginning of 2015 who all became B Corps at the same time, including Squiz. That's how I became involved in that. And about 2 years ago, the French government decided to launch a big reform package called the PACT law, mainly targeted at helping small and medium-sized businesses transform. So it's supposed to simplify a certain number of, let's say, administrative things, but also take another look at corporate governance a little bit. And the community of B Corps was very much involved in that, and greatly helped by Rick and OC, and also, so I'm speaking French, and also Bill Clark from B Lab. We really appreciated having them on board with us. It was a tricky process. Obviously, sometimes in Europe, you can feel a bit of sort of like anti-American back when it comes to anything that originated in America. And so we had to face that. And the law that eventually came out of it, Rick just listed a long list of benefit corporation statutes around the world, did not, unfortunately, fall into it. We took a slightly different road from the Italians. And while at the outset, the law looks very much the same, when you reach the part where you're going to basically control, you've now changed in your corporate statutes, you put your mission in your corporate statutes, you only have to control the possibly limited goals that you set yourself. So it's much closer to what's called a social purpose corporation in the United States than a benefit corporation, where you have a requirement to look at, the ensemble of operations of the company. So, and I actually made a little slide about that. I can show you guys. Okay. So here we go. So I've got a little slide to show you about legal status that did come, which is called the Société à Mission. And basically, to become a Société à Mission, a company has to define 3 things: raison d'être, one or more social and or environmental objectives within the framework of its business model. And then they must create a dedicated monitoring committee with at least 1 employee. And then after that, control report that's made by this monitoring committee. So that's where that law stands today, the Société à Mission, sometimes also called Entreprise à Mission.
Is this the form that? Sorry. Is this the form that Danone just took on? Is it? This is the legal form that they are introducing?
Yes, exactly. So Danone has now adopted also the quality. Actually, it's a legal quality. It's not a new kind of legal form. like the benefit corporation is. It's just something that you add to your basically your paperwork, your charter. You receive the stamp that says your société à mission. And this is
Can I
something
ask you a
that
question, Elizabeth? Can I ask you a question, Elizabeth, about that? Because I think you said that, you know, it wasn't the benefit corporation in the sense that it wasn't broad because you could adopt a raison d'etre, but is it the case that you can adopt a raison d'etre, which is essentially as broad as benefit corporation law? And
it's good that you bring that up, Rick, because actually, so there's three parts again, if you remember my slide of this law. And the first part, the raison d'etre, all B Corps in France have a raison d'etre. We all fall into this law because since 2015, obviously, like every B Corp around the world, we have been required either to adopt the benefit corporation status if it exists where we live, or amend our corporate charter. So we've all done that. We all have a raison d'etre. It's the second part that changes, where you have to insert, again, one or more environmental and or social missions. Similar again to the SPC model in the United States.
Okay, this is very interesting, and it leads me to the next question after having heard the introductions. So if you think about the benefit corporation concept and the different initiatives, and when you think about the momentum that you know, enacting corporate purpose within corporations, that is the current momentum that is going on, and the discussions. And when you think about this, if you were to pinpoint what public policy projects are actually important in this global shift in the economy, can you identify the ones you think are most important? Do you think enacting corporate purpose is one of the public policy projects? Do you think, you know, I'm trying to look for some suggestions towards the European Commission and European Union. It seems like Europe is taking a bit of a lead in this area, and they're looking for ideas. So what are your thoughts on this? Who wants to go first?
I'll take a shot. So, you know, I think there's one way to think about it is there's two important levels. We've been talking so far, I think, about the fiduciary obligations at the level of the company. So if you're a director or an officer of a company, you know, your relationship to shareholders, is it to like maximize value no matter what? Is it to, you know, maximize value but also consider the interests of stakeholders? Is it, you know, to consider stakeholders first and like whatever that's left for the shareholders, that's what they get. But if you only focus there, you miss a really important part, you know, of the equation, which is, well, what about the corporate governance of all the people who are managing the money that's going into the companies? Because for the most part, you know, the companies aren't just held by individuals, they're held by huge funds that have their own fiduciary duties. It may be a pension fund, it may be a sovereign wealth fund, maybe a mutual fund, an endowment, a foundation. I mean, I don't know the statistics in Europe, but in the United States, you know, 85% of shares of publicly traded companies are held by institutional shareholders. And so for us in the US, a huge part of this equation is what are the fiduciary duties of the trustees of those funds to their beneficiaries. For a sovereign wealth fund, that would be the citizens of the country. For a mutual fund, it would be the mutual fund shareholders. For a pension fund, obviously the beneficiaries of the pension. And you know, in Europe, I think there's a lot of action around that with the sustainable finance, all this stuff going on sustainable finance. In the US, there is currently a little bit of movement there. Depending on what happens in the election, I think there could be a lot of movement there. You know, the current administration is actually pushing to make those fiduciaries more focused on short-term profits at individual companies rather than thinking about the system. But, you know, I would think that an important part of disrupting the financial system, how private capital is allocated and stewarded is at that fiduciary level as well as the company level. Because you could almost think of like there's a chain. It starts with like individual savers, and it goes through, a mutual fund, and that mutual fund has sub-advisors and proxy advisors, and then it goes into the company, and the company decides what to do with it. And finally, through that long chain, our private capital gets invested in the real economy. And so if we impose fiduciary duties that were, this is an opinion, of course, but I would say more sensible, more just, more long-term, fiduciary principles all along that chain, I think we'd get much better results. And, without getting too much into the weeds of economics, there's an economist named Thomas Schelling who, won a Nobel Prize in the 70s for his discussion about the difference between micro motives and macro outcomes. And he sort of just talked about, traffic. If everybody tried to get where they were going as fast as they could without following any rules, nobody would get anywhere. It would be much better to have somebody higher up thinking about having a traffic system. And so the idea is that we should be thinking about public policy that imposes on those fiduciaries an obligation not just to maximize value at individual companies or investees, but to think about the system, because by allocating capital and stewarding capital, they have the responsibility over that system. And if they take that responsibility seriously, in the long run, their beneficiaries are going to do better. So I would say that's where the opportunity is, both at the company level, but also at the trustee level.
Is this what you're doing with the shareholder commons? Is this the idea you have, and the providing guardrails for investors and the financial system?
That is, and so after I was at B Lab for about 4 years, I started realizing that as important as it was to get companies on the right track the way B Lab does, they were fighting against a huge headwind, because they had all these investors who were saying, oh, I have a fiduciary duty to maximize value. What are you doing caring about your stakeholders? And so we started an organization called the Shareholders Commons. It's an NGO in the US. And our goal is to sort of focus asset owners and asset managers on this idea that they should be managing. It's called the Shareholder Commons from the idea that there are these common resources, whether it's the air we breathe, the oceans, a stable society, civil society, all those are common goods that we share that are at risk from individuals sort of grabbing too much of them. And so we encourage and try to provide tools to asset owners and asset managers. You mentioned guardrails. That would be a tool where, all the big asset managers could agree that, every company in our portfolio needs to have a policy of being carbon neutral by 2050. And obviously governments are trying to do this too, but to the extent that government isn't successful for whatever reason, or government differ across borders, the capital markets are global. And the idea of a guardrail is if you can sort of do it across the board, it doesn't affect competition. Because right now it's very hard to ask one company to do something if another company isn't, unless you can make the business case at each company that it will be better for them. But from the broad perspective, as an investor in an index fund, I'd rather a company gave up value if it was getting that value by hurting the rest of the systems. And so yeah, that's what we're trying to do at TSC. And we have some policy initiatives as well as the guardrails initiative.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for this explanation. It's really great, and I'm holding my thumbs, my fingers. for success. I think it's one of the important pieces of the puzzle to get the finance system in line with sustainability. And if you look what coronavirus did, I think the momentum is here, and it was never this much and this quick, I think. So going to Elizabeth, what are your thoughts on working with EU? What are the public policy projects that we should be focusing on in order to achieve a sustainable future in Europe?
In Europe,
For starters.
So, as Rick pointed out, I mean, we might call the regulatory environment is a big part of the market in which any company exercises. I mean, most people know that the free market is completely a myth. As Rick gave the traffic example, sometimes I often give the example of a board game. Every board game has a rules. And the one we're currently playing is called Monopoly, which was invented to demonstrate how railroad monopolies were all wrong, but then that all got twisted up, kind of, as often happens. And so in some ways I consider myself and other members of the default community like hackers. We're just hacking the Monopoly game right now, but we haven't fundamentally changed it, not yet. You mentioned regulations. There was a law that was enacted in France 3 years ago. I also want to show something about called the duty of vigilance, which basically imposes on all companies with more than 5,000 employees or 10,000 employees worldwide to set up vigilance plans, which basically means just to make sure that not only what they're doing, but also the practices and operations of their suppliers also respect kind of minimum ethical standards. So, that's a big part of it. There's a part that's just voluntary, which is very much what we do with Europe. It's the changes that we make and the goals that we set for ourselves are voluntary. And then there's the regulatory environment, where it's a matter of conformity, making sure that everyone is meeting those minimum standards of corporate behaviors, and this is obviously complicated by the fact that we live in a world market. And as you said, coronavirus made people think about a lot of things. And while I definitely think that there clearly inherent goodness in thinking about buying local as a general idea, I don't think we're ready to end international trade either. I'm not sure that would be the healthiest thing that could happen. Clearly, when sometimes I speak about the fact that French people who do live in a system with very strong regulations and huge worker protections and huge social protections in general, very strong healthcare system and school system, we would feel like perfectly okay buying products that were made in factories by people who have absolutely none of that. Kind of an odd thing to do, if you try to have that sit with you. And when I started my own business, that was the first time it really sat with me, because again, when I'm going out and buying, one pen made I don't know where, not the same thing as when I'm ordering 200,000, and selling them and being responsible for that. It changes your perspective on. So the regulatory environment in general is one way to enact change. Do you want me to talk a little bit about B-Lab in the EU? Just a moment for that.
Yeah. If you have any thoughts on what we should be doing in EU particularly, that would be great. With B-Lab EU.
So probably everyone listening in is aware that the EU has something called the Green Deal, which is a wonderful framework into which you can embed the concept of stakeholder governance, and also lots of other financial improvements, accounting improvements. And B-Lab on a European level is already engaged on specific consultations, including around financial reporting. We'll have to clap Wojciech because he very much contributed to a recent submission that we made. Obviously, one big topic is specifically around EU initiatives on corporate structures and existing corporate structures and behavior. And for example, the French duty of vigilance, could that be taken on a European level? Or the Italian società benefit, that be taken on a European level? Or the Société Benefit, competing a little bit with the Société Mission? How will the EU look at these new, these new corporate structures and integrate them and share them? And we all know that the EU is a wonderful big sisterhood of a whole bunch of different ideas, and we're trying to do our best to cooperate. Sometimes that's more challenging than other moments.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so because when I'm thinking about like the legal forms, the different legal forms that we have available, benefit corporation, for instance, in the States, and then the different legal forms like the French one or the Italian one, and then I'm thinking, should we regulate? Because lawyers like to regulate everything. And the question is, should we let companies do their job? I mean, amending their statutes in accordance, of course, with the law, but most jurisdictions in Europe are quite flexible. And I think that even if we go to the US, there's a lot of flexibility there. So the question is, should we let these companies do whatever they want in a sense of, regulating their own sustainable practices and putting obligations on directors, etc.? Or we should be actually thinking of a EU-wide legal form that is available and off the shelf, like the benefit corporation? That's a tough question to a lawyer, Rick, I think.
So, yeah, and I'll tell you a little bit about, in the US, where we're going with that question, because, as I described earlier, there's been this movement across states to make benefit corporation law available. So that means you can do it if you want to do it, but you don't have to. So, the first regulatory question would be, well, should you just have it mandatory? And then there's this other question kind of in between, which is, if you have the idea of stakeholder governance, should it be binary in the sense that you either flip it on or off? And that second question, I would be a proponent of the idea that an off-the-shelf version is best, because it just lets everybody know what it means. Because lawyers can put lots of tricky words, and then you don't know, okay, am I dealing with a company that must care about shareholders, or that can care about or stakeholders, or that can to this extent? And why not just have a level playing field that says, this is what it means to be a benefit corporation. It means you consider these interests, and it means you give this kind of transparency. But that, to me, just brings up maybe the harder first question, which is, well, why would you have some companies operate like that and others not? Because it's almost like you're saying, well, let's have two kinds of companies in the world: one that imposes external costs on the system, and one that doesn't. And maybe the one that doesn't will attract more conscious consumers, but a lot of people that I know just go to the store and they buy the cheapest thing, and that's and then they brag about it, and that's the end of that's the end of the analysis. So in the States, Elizabeth Warren, a senator, left-leaning senator, a couple of years ago, basically suggested that any company that operated in the U.S. that had sales of $1 billion or more would have to be a benefit corporation. I think there are going to be proposals coming out within the next few weeks around this idea, and in anticipation, again, we'll see what happens, but in anticipation of a new leadership in Washington, I think there may be a push for that. And I think the other thing that's reflective is the EY report, because they sort of, they very carefully go through the idea of encouraging, giving an opportunity versus a directive, and the directive gets a lot more points on their scale. So that's
I totally agree, but I have a problem with the EY report, actually, because I'm reading it a bit differently. For me, a proposition of a directive is a bit too weak, actually. I would propose a regulation.
I see.
And then have a separate legal form for each of the countries, you know, regulated, because the problem with directives is that they may be implemented differently in different jurisdictions, and we're going to have a bunch of different legislations all around Europe. And in order to achieve the outcome you're looking for, in a sense of having all corporations comply, I think that would be the best proposal. But of course, I think we're at the beginning of the discussions, and that would be quite tough. And Elizabeth, what are your thoughts on this? Rick just had a really interesting argument. He made an interesting argument. What do you think?
I think we're still playing Monopoly. So some people are like playing it nice, you know, and some people are going for the board. So, you know, and again, it's this very delicate balance within Europe and on a global scale of everyone setting their own rules. And you'll hear a lot of people talk about, you know, market specific behavior. I was personally very shocked a few years ago when a big French automaker, whose name I won't mention, started making cars in India and like didn't auto stop seatbelts. And we all know that when you have to adjust your own seatbelt yourself without the special auto stop system, not nearly as effective. Not nearly as effective. Why are they doing this? And when I spoke to people who worked there, they were like, "That's, you know, it's already big, like for India." Like, okay, but again, are we having an ethical scale, you know, based on local specificities? And so, since this is like already better than what they have, that's okay, but we would never accept it where we live. Again, you know, we have a very adjustable ethical approach to business on a global scale today. And the EU already, as you pointed out, Wojciech, could come together on that. It would be a huge step. If the United States could come together on that, you know, if we could, you know, as more local groups make more progress together, then that would only encourage more progress around the world.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, I have one more thought, and this may be a tricky question also for starting with Rick, and it just popped into my mind. So we have this two ways of actually influencing companies to comply. One is, you know, regulation and trying to force them, you know, to become B Corps or try to, you know, comply with the sustainability practices. But the other, and it's, I think, in the US commonly used or thought of, is litigation. What are your thoughts on this? Because, you know, if we are looking at companies and different business roundtable, you know, statements, whether they are actually putting, you know, harsher standards on themselves for their conduct, you know, do you see litigation possibilities from different, you know, environmental consumer groups? You know, that's a tricky question for the public benefit corporation, I think, in Delaware, right?
Yeah, but let me just back up and say, not putting off the benefit corporation litigation, there's interesting questions just with regular corporations, and it doesn't have to be consumer groups. It could be rap stars. There was an argument in the Delaware Chancery Court yesterday in a case brought by Jay-Z. And he is suing a company saying they have sort of a relation to the private prison industry, which is very controversial in the U.S. And like it's a whole like terrible subject that we won't go into. But the company has said, well, you're just complaining about our social, and you know that doesn't really matter. Like, we're here to make money, and you're complaining that we have a bad social profile. So how can a shareholder sue us for that? And I think that even though in Delaware, for standard corporations, the law is well established that the directors work for the shareholders, what isn't so explored in the case law is what that means. Because you're going back to what I said in answer to a couple questions ago, if you're a typical shareholder, you're invested in, you know, hundreds or thousands of companies through index funds or at least mutual funds. And what's going to matter to you is what the financial set called beta, the market return, not the alpha or the return from a single company. So if the market does well over the long term, you'll do well. And if your company is like making money, by treating prisoners poorly and all the things that happen, those individuals are going to return to society, and they're not going to have skills, and they're not going to be, psychologically, well adjusted, and they're going to be a burden. And not just a burden, it's not just the burden, it's the absence of a benefit, because, you can re-enter society and provide lots of good things and help the economy grow. And so, I think there's an argument to be made that the average shareholder at that company, Centene, would actually benefit if the company hewed to a more reasonable social platform. And I would love to, I don't think this will be our opportunity, but as an organization, TSC, we'd like to intervene in some of these lawsuits and say, hey, you guys are arguing about the wrong thing. I think there's a real opportunity.
Yeah. Time flies very quickly. I'm sorry, I keep receiving messages that we need to wrap up. Actually, it's amazing. This was a very interesting discussion. I would like to thank you, Elizabeth, for being with us. Thank you, Rick, for your thoughts.
Thank you.
Just one sentence for the end. I think if you're listening to us, and especially if you're a young lawyer looking to engage in some interesting projects, I would encourage everybody to look into public policy. However bad you may think working with public policy issues may be, just get involved and yeah. Thank you for being here. Let's keep on discussing. Follow us on LinkedIn. Shoot us an email if you have any questions, and we look forward to seeing you in the future and working together on making a meaningful change. So. Thank you again.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for
Thank you.
listening.